Over the last 2 years, Geno Smith has been one of the best stories in the NFL. What could Jared Goff's massive extension with the Lions mean for his future and the future of the Seahawks quarterback position? We'll be diving in on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in, whether you're in Nashville, Tennessee, or Dallas, Texas. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. As we draw closer to the start of OTAs, there's a certain unofficial holiday that's coming up tomorrow, the NFL schedule reveal. We know a few leaks already, at least that have been reported, unofficial leaks. We'll be diving into that, plus some predictions for what we expect to see on Seattle's 2024 schedule. And we'll continue our undrafted free agents with a speedy kick returner, as well as a former high school teammate of Byron Murphy II, who is now teammates with him once again in a Seahawks uniform. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Over the last couple of seasons, Jared Goff has really turned his career trajectory around. As some of you listening may remember, was a Rams #1 overall pick, led the Rams to a Super Bowl, and then a couple years later, they kicked him to the curb for Matthew Stafford in a quarterback-for-quarterback swap. And a lot of people were wondering how long it was going to be till the Detroit Lions drafted a quarterback. And yet here we are now, and Jared Goff is one of the 5 highest paid quarterbacks in the NFL per season, $53 million per year on the new extension that he signed with the Lions. And Rob, that really leads into a Seahawks-centric topic here, and I think there will be other teams that are going to be impacted by this as well. But when you're looking at the money that teams are throwing around at quarterbacks now, and obviously Jared Goff earned this. He led the Detroit Lions to an NFC championship game and almost dethroned San Francisco to get to the Super Bowl. He made the Pro Bowl. He's been one of the best passers all around in the league the last 2 years. He earned this massive contract, and yet from a perspective of a team like the Seahawks, there's going to be a ripple effect, whether it's with Geno Smith or eventually Sam Howell being the quarterback. This type of a contract is going to have a bearing on that.
No, it absolutely is. That's the thing, is that regardless of how you feel that Jared Goff stacks up in terms of the pecking order of NFL quarterbacks, clearly the Detroit Lions feel very excited about him. As you mentioned, Jared Goff is now among the top 5 quarterbacks in terms of annual salary. He's actually number 2. Only Joe Burrow is averaging more money per season for the next 4 years than the $53.5 million that Jared Goff is going to be receiving over the next 4 years. And that's just mind-boggling numbers. And when you put his statistics up against Geno Smith, the fact that Geno Smith twice has beat Jared Goff over the last couple of years when they faced against the Detroit Lions, I think you can make a strong argument that Geno Smith deserves similar money and perhaps is going to be in line to get himself quite the pay raise moving forward. But before you go too far down that angle, it is important to remember just the fact that the Detroit Lions have not had a great deal of success. And they basically, I think, feel like this is their opportunity. And so they are kind of cash committed to Jared Goff. This is their opportunity here. And the fact that Jared Goff is 4 years younger than Geno Smith and has a longer track record of success than Geno Smith here. So while I do think that there is an argument to be made that ultimately Geno Smith or perhaps Sam Howell is going to be raking in tens of millions of dollars, just like Jared Goff, I don't think that it is truly an apples to apples comparison, considering where the Seahawks are now with a brand new head coach and looking to, in some people's minds, rebuild a little bit, or at least reestablish themselves as a playoff contender. And as you mentioned, Jared Goff is a couple of time Pro Bowler here consecutively and led the Lions to the AFC Championship game, and just a whisker away from a Super Bowl berth. Maybe the Lions are in a little bit different position than the Seahawks are.
Yeah, I don't think you can compare these two situations, though a couple years ago, it was pretty much the same discussion point in both Seattle and Detroit. As I mentioned a few moments ago, when Jared Goff came over in that trade of the Rams, and then the Lions ended up winning only a couple games his first year as the starting quarterback, there was a lot of murmurs out there. When is Detroit going to draft a QB early in the first round so they can find the successor to Jared Goff? He's not the answer, and yet here we are a couple years later. The Lions haven't invested a high pick in the quarterback position. Jared Goff is the man, and they're paying him the money accordingly. He earned that money with the last 2 years. He's been really good the last 2 seasons. But I think if you look at Geno Smith and what the Seahawks have done, from John Schneider's perspective, this is where the Sam Howell trade really becomes fascinating as a case study here, because it's a different wrinkle than what the Detroit Lions have done. If the Detroit Lions would have gone out and traded for Sam Howell, you can guarantee that would have created some controversy there in Detroit. Is Jared Goff really the long-term guy? So Seattle is kind of opening the door for that, but it's also about flexibility. And as you mentioned, Geno Smith is 4 years older than Jared Goff. So this isn't comparing two identical situations. One is a significantly older quarterback, though he's had a lot less games. Maybe he's a young 33 going on 34, but still, this is really a league where teams pay quarterbacks based on two things: wins and wins. It's about how many games you are winning. It doesn't matter. I mean, the touchdown passes can be part of it, but winning is 1A and 1B in this league. It is a bottom line business. And so Jared Goff was obviously going to get that contract with where he led the Lions, who have been perennially one of the worst teams in the NFL. But you look at the records comparatively, I mean, the Lions didn't make the playoffs 2 years ago, so Goff's only led the Lions to the playoffs one of the last 2 years, same as Geno Smith. Really, the difference here is the Lions breaking through and getting over the hump last year to win a playoff game and nearly get to the Super Bowl. And I think that's really the big difference because, again, those watching on YouTube, you can see these numbers, but when you compare the last 2 years, Geno Smith has more game-winning drives. He has more big-time throws, nearly double the number of big-time throws, according to Pro Football Focus. So the degree of difficulty on the completions he's making, by that metric, he's way ahead. He has a higher completion above expected rate per NFL Next Gen stats each of the last 2 years, and he's got a higher completion rate. So, yes, Goff's got more passing yards. He's got more touchdowns, one less interception, a slightly higher passer rating. But I mean, when you look, Rob, at these two quarterbacks side by side, and they're very similar skill set. They both are primarily pocket passers, though Geno Smith has much more running ability than what Jared Goff does. And he showed that the last 2 years. And you add in the fact that in the advanced metrics, and I wrote an article about this today, you can find it on All Seahawks. In the advanced metrics, almost everything is leaning towards Geno Smith. And then when you consider he had the 28th ranked offensive line protecting him last year, and Jared Goff had the 9th best, that makes the numbers against pressure, where Geno Smith was significantly better the last 2 years than Jared Goff, that makes that even more impressive. So I guess what I'm arguing here, and you'll have an opportunity to weigh in on this as well, but I think that this Jared Goff contract is huge for the Seattle Seahawks, because if Geno Smith goes out and has a monster season with Ryan Grubb's offense, which I think there's a very good chance that that could happen. If he puts up massive numbers, let's say he has better numbers than Jared Goff, it wouldn't be far-fetched. He's right there with him the last 2 years. And he's got 1 year left in his contract. He's been pretty team-friendly with his contract the last couple of years. I think he and his agent are going to be saying, hey, you guys need to pay us now, especially if the Seahawks win a playoff game or two. If they manage to do that and he has a great season, Sam Howell might be the future, but that would certainly curtail the idea of changing quarterbacks. And John Schneider then would have to make the difficult decision. Am I going to pay him what he deserves, or am I going to go to Sam Howell, who is still a relative unknown compared to Geno Smith? So it really does create a fascinating situation for the Seahawks quarterback room in general the next couple of years.
Yes, it's a huge if, though. Geno Smith has to be able to put up those kind of that production and lead the Seahawks to the playoffs, as you mentioned, Corbin. And that's one of the things that I definitely want to mention here in terms of this comparison from Jared Goff to Geno Smith. One of the things I do think is similar to what happened in Detroit this past year, and perhaps the Seahawks moving forward, is that the Detroit Lions did kind of hedge their bet on Jared Goff by selecting Hendon Hooker in the draft. He is the presumptive quarterback of the future in Detroit. And I think that kind of competition, that slight perhaps in Jared Goff and perhaps his representatives' perspective, maybe push Jared Goff to be that much more successful this past season. I think the same thing with the Seahawks making the trade for Sam Howell, with there being obviously a brand new offensive coordinator here in Ryan Grubb, as you mentioned. If Geno Smith is to have essentially the greatest statistical season of his career, as Jared Goff basically did at this past season, then yes, I do think that the Seahawks will be in position to have to reward Geno Smith for his success. But until that actually happens, I think that Geno Smith should be feeling, pretty comfortable with the fact that he is being paid about average among starting NFL quarterbacks, and considering that his touchdowns to interception ratio and those quarterback wins, as you correctly stated, that is really what it comes down to when you're in terms of paying quarterbacks. He is pretty middle of the pack. And so I do agree that Geno Smith took a little bit of a team-friendly contract a year ago. At the same time, I don't believe that he is grossly underpaid. He is going to have to perform, above and beyond to warrant the Seahawks deciding to rip up his current contract or create some type of extension rather than looking towards the future with the aforementioned Sam Howell.
And I do think John Schneider is pushing this button to an extent because he has seen some other teams do this. Hey, can I get that little extra out of Geno Smith by having this guy that is going to be pushing for snaps in Sam Howell that has started quite a few games in the NFL? So this is a situation I think John Schneider's looking at as win-win. If Geno does not elevate his game, hey, I've got a young quarterback I'm really excited about. If he does elevate his game and this team wins a playoff game or two and even wins the NFC West, if Geno Smith plays to that level in Ryan Grubb's offense, John Schneider's going to say, hey, look what I did. I ended up sparking this performance out of him by bringing in extra competition in Sam Howell. So I do, as I said, I think this is very fascinating. And now seeing that deal for Jared Goff, that's the little bit of the risk here for the Seattle Seahawks, is if Geno Smith goes out and has that monster year, you better be ready to open up the checkbook, or you're going to be taking a major gamble going to Sam Howell, not knowing whether or not he can be that level of productive in the NFL. Up next, the NFL schedule reveal is coming tomorrow night. There's already some games that are getting leaked, though not a lot with the Seahawks so far, at least at this point. Rob and I are going to look at the latest rumors, and we're going to have some predictions for Seahawks schedule Wednesday. That'll be coming up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode of Locked On Seahawks is brought your way by Game Time. You shouldn't have to worry about ripping out your hair when you buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, and theater events near you. They've got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices. You can view your seat. And with their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Back in March, I got NCAA tournament first and second round tickets for my mother and I at Indianapolis, and we were able to get passes for the entire weekend for under $400 a piece for 6 games with Game Time. We had an absolute blast, and thanks to Game Time's best price guarantee, it didn't cost an arm and a leg for an awesome experience. Game Time has similar deals on tickets right at the day of the event, and the Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price to write your own memories. If you find tickets in the same section in a row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download a Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you for listening in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We're going to have a couple of shows coming up tomorrow. We will have a regular Wednesday show. And, of course, when the schedule drops, we will have a bonus instant reaction episode that will be coming your way. So make sure you are listening into both episodes of Locked On Seahawks coming tomorrow on the annual schedule reveal day. Speaking of the NFL schedule, Rob, this is becoming an unofficial holiday for sports fans. And I know that there's plenty of people that I see on social media saying, wait, I don't really care that much about this. Well, then why are you talking about it? Absolutely, people eat up the leaks that come out, and sometimes they end up not being true. So that's going to be the caveat we are going to have here. Now, we don't have a lot of rumors to discuss with the Seahawks schedule. They've done a pretty good job keeping things bottled up to this point, but we do have a few things to discuss. But as a disclaimer, these are unofficial. We have seen times where well-sourced people get bad information. So let's not just sit here and say we absolutely 100% know that these things are going to happen. But the first big rumor coming from our friend Dave Softy Mahler from KJR Seattle, he reported that the Seahawks are going to be playing the Denver Broncos in week 1 at Lumen Field. And if that sounds familiar, only 2 years ago, they did the same thing. But obviously the stakes are a little bit different here with Russell Wilson now being in Pittsburgh. So we're not going to get that reunion coming back to Seattle for a second time in 3 years. Nonetheless, former AFC West rivals that have quite a rich history against each other. The Broncos likely to be breaking in Bo Nix as their new starting quarterback. So there should still be plenty of storylines if that is indeed the season opener for the Seahawks.
Yeah, if that is the case, I think it's going to be a fascinating matchup. As you mentioned, the former AFC West rivals, so the old school Seahawk and Bronco fans out there are going to be all in with this potential matchup. The new school Pacific Northwest fans with Bo Nix potentially returning and perhaps in a starting role for the Denver Broncos, that would be fascinating if that is indeed the case. Sean Payton returning to Seattle. Of course, he was the head coach in the Beast Quake and some of the more memorable games in which the Seahawks have beaten the New Orleans Saints previously. So there's a lot of different storylines that I think would make that a really appetizing opener for the Seahawks and for the Denver Broncos as well. I also think from a Seahawks perspective, that's also a very winnable game. And I think that is certainly important as well. Just a couple of years ago when Russell Wilson and the Denver Broncos came into town, of course, the Broncos were the heavy favorite, and I don't think that would be the case in this situation, whether it be Bo Nix, whether it be Jarrett Stidham, whoever is at quarterback for the Denver Broncos, perhaps Zach Wilson. I just think that when you look at the matchup of the Seahawks versus the Broncos, it does look like a very winnable game for Seattle. And so, again, if the Broncos are, in fact, the opener for the Seahawks, then I do think that sets up very well for the club to get off to a hot start. And that's exactly what Mike McDowell needs to be able to convince not only his own team, but the fan base that this is the future and the future is going to lead to the playoffs.
Yeah, this is one of those where I wasn't surprised by the leak because the Seahawks were likely going to be playing at home since the Mariners and the Sounders were both having away games that weekend. And that's usually how the NFL tries to schedule things. And also the fact that a lot of other games in that first week had been reported with teams that were on the Seahawks schedule. So there was only a handful of teams that it could have been for this week 1 matchup. So not surprising that this ends up being the same week 1 matchup we saw a couple years ago. I'd be surprised if it's a primetime matchup like it was when Wilson was coming back to Seattle for the first time, but still going to be playing the Broncos in week 1. The other thing that we now know, at least based on reported information, I know a lot of Seahawks fans, especially our British listeners, were really hoping the Seahawks were going to be playing the Chicago Bears in London. That was the one remaining opportunity for Seattle to have an international game this year. And unfortunately, for our listeners overseas that were hoping to see the Seahawks across the pond, it's not going to happen this year. The Jacksonville Jaguars will be playing as the road team against the Chicago Bears in London in week 6. So that completely rules out the Seahawks having a game in London or any of the international sites this year. So that's the other thing we can report. We don't know what week they're playing the Chicago Bears, but when they do, Caleb Williams and company are going to be playing on their home turf at Soldier Field, not over at Wembley Stadium in London.
Yeah, and that obviously is disappointing for a variety of different reasons. But to me, one of the interesting things about that is that it does suggest that the Seahawks are likely to have a primetime game elsewhere, of course, hopefully at Lumen Field. And so to me, there's some fascinating matchups that the Seahawks, will be having. We don't know the schedule as of yet. We're about 24 hours from that, but we do certainly know Seattle's home opponents. That, of course, is going to be the three NFC West divisional rivals, the Arizona Cardinals, San Francisco 49ers, and the Los Angeles Rams, but also the Buffalo Bills, Miami Dolphins, Green Bay Packers, Minnesota Vikings, aforementioned Denver Broncos, and the New York Giants. And I am particularly intrigued by the high-octane offenses of the Miami Dolphins, Buffalo Bills, and the Green Bay Packers. I'm also intrigued by the Minnesota Vikings just because, selfishly, J.J. McCarthy, I think that sounds like a fascinating matchup as well. But I want to focus in and kind of call my shot here. I do think if the Seahawks are likely to host a game and be on national television, Monday Night Football, Sunday Night Football, Thursday Night Football, I think it's going to be one of those high-profile matchups against the Bills, the Dolphins, or especially the Green Bay Packers. Look, Pete Carroll obviously is no longer in the squad. The Seahawks don't have the quarterback matchup that we've seen in the past, say Geno Smith versus Russell Wilson, but John Schneider is now the big name in Seattle, and a lot of people across the league, of course, still associate John Schneider with his days back in Green Bay, the fact that the Green Bay Packers are a club that is, kind of rocking and rolling themselves a little bit with what Jordan Love was able to do. To me, that is one of the matchups that would make an awful lot of sense to be that nationally broadcast football game that we as Seahawks fans and Seahawks followers have grown accustomed to over the last 15 years.
I'm going to call my shot, and I'm going to go even more specific than what you did. I'm going to use a Charles Barkley guaranteed right now. I think the Seattle Seahawks and Miami Dolphins, you can book that for a primetime matchup. I'm not going to say whether it's Monday, Sunday, or Thursday, but I think those two teams, not just the fact that you've got Reek Woolen and Devin Witherspoon going up against Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and Odell Beckham Jr. I mean, that by itself is worth the price of admission, but Mike McDaniel versus Mike McDonald, the battle of the offensive and defensive young masterminds. You can't tell me that one of the big networks is not wanting to sell that game. So that is the one that I am thoroughly convinced will be one of the primetime games for the Seattle Seahawks. And if that does come to fruition, as I'm prognosticating here, that means at least one home game in primetime for the Seattle Seahawks going up against Tua Tagovailoa and the Miami Dolphins. When we come back next, we have our next two players on our undrafted free agent previews. We're going to be checking out a speedy kick returner from Tennessee, as well as a former teammate of Byron Murphy II, who's now teammates with him once again in the Pacific Northwest. We'll get to that here in a moment on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by our friends at FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball is now more than a month into the season, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150. Win or lose. Do you think Nate McKinnon's finally going to break out and get a hat trick for the desperate Avalanche as they look to ward off elimination against the Stars? Is George Kirby going to keep striking guys out for the Mariners on the mound? Are you feeling optimistic about the Cavaliers bouncing back with Donovan Mitchell scoring 30 or more points in Game 5? You can bet on it all in an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. As we continue to take a deep dive into all of Seattle's undrafted signings, there's going to be a little bit of a focus on special teams to start things off here. And Rob, sometimes this is the best ticket for an undrafted rookie to make an NFL roster, especially when you consider that the Seahawks are trying to replace their main kick and punt returner from a year ago, DJ Dallas. And this has been a player that you've been talking up ever since we got the list of officially signed undrafted free agents. Dee Williams from Tennessee. He's played some corner. He's played some receiver. But he mostly was known in the SEC as arguably the most dangerous punt returner in the entire conference the last couple of years. Over 500 punt return yards, 2 of them returned for touchdowns. And when you watch him on film, you're thinking that guy's he's probably a 4.3 guy, but he ran in the low 4.5s. But his suddenness, he's one of those guys that is just quicker on the football field than he is in timed runs, and he's really slippery. Williams could be that player if he's able to take what he did in the SEC as a punt returner, and he is able to at least show some growth as a receiver. Still a position he's fairly raw at, but if he is able to do those two things with his athletic ability, the ability to do damage with the football in his hands, this guy may very well be one of the undrafted free agents that has the best opportunity to make this Seahawks roster.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth, Corbin. I really do think that Dee Williams, the return specialist from Tennessee, really is among the favorites to make a, to get himself on the Seahawks roster. And I don't mean on the practice squad, because I do believe that this is not a player at this point who has the polish as a wide receiver or as a cornerback to be able to make this roster. But on special teams, his ability as a return man, both in punts and kicks and in punt and kick coverage. That's where I do believe that he might be able to carve out a spot for himself. Just think about the depth chart at cornerback and wide receiver for the Seahawks. It's pretty top heavy. The Seahawks have some stars on both sides of the ball. And so I do think that they are uniquely positioned to be able to kind of have a player who is going to be your fifth or sixth wide receiver or corner, for example, and not be asked to play that much just because you have such faith in the DK Metcalfs, the Jackson Smith and Jigbas, the Tyler Lockett's, or the Devin Witherspoons, the Reek Woolens, the Mike Jack, whatever the case might be. And so again, when you watch this young man on tape, he was the best returner in the SEC this past season, both statistically and in terms of the eye test. And again, not only as a punt returner, but as a kick returner as well. He was a junior college player, so he's only been at Tennessee for the last 2 seasons, but he returned punts 4 touchdowns 2 years ago. I believe it was against Vanderbilt. This past season, he had one against Texas A&M that counted, one against South Carolina that through no fault of his own was called back due to a penalty. And as you said, Corbin, I mean, maybe he wasn't quite as fast in terms of the stopwatch, but he typically catches the ball while running forward. He attacks the hole like very few returners I've seen in this draft class. He bounces off of contact. He is able to set up defenders because he's kind of almost like a chess player. I mean, he is a move or two ahead of the defense. Yep. And so to me, again, I think that Dee Williams, 5'11", 190 pounders, I know that he ran in the 4.5s, but he plays like a guy who runs in the 4.3s. I think that he is the best returner on their roster at this point. I would not be surprised at all if he winds up making the initial 53.
And I think when you mentioned the chess piece aspect, that is going to be especially important in kick returns now with the new rules. And we talked about this earlier, why I think D. Eskridge and Laviska Shenault are good candidates in this new rule book on kick returns, because they both have that running back background previously, where I feel like these kick returns are going to be a lot like run plays. And so it's going to be a different feel. But I feel like this is one of those guys that he's just going to be able to return kicks and punts regardless, because he just has that natural feel. He has that natural touch, catching punts, which you go to an NFL practice, you watch these guys muff punts. Like, it is a very difficult craft to master. And we've seen some really good players that can't even catch punts consistently. And this guy is able to do it on a running start. So that gives him a great opportunity to make this team. And that cornerback, as you said, if he's able to do something on kick and punt coverage units as well, if he could be a really good gunner, that's just another foot in the door to making this football team. So he's a fascinating player to watch going into OTAs to see where the Seahawks fit him in. And once we get to the preseason, is he able to earn a spot because of his explosiveness? I heard a few announcers nickname him the Blur. That's the way that he plays the game. As a kick and punt returner, Seattle could certainly use that kind of juice on special teams. Now let's shift back to the trenches. Seattle's got a number of defensive linemen they signed as undrafted free agents. We've looked at Buda Jones. Yesterday we had Nathan Pickering, who was just added to the roster for Mississippi State. Now we're going to talk about a guy that actually has a really interesting connection with Seattle's first-round pick, Byron Murphy II. Devere Levelston played at DeSoto High School with Byron Murphy II. They were teammates in high school. Now they're teammates in the NFL level. And if you go back a couple years ago, Levelston looked like he was going to be a potential draft pick in the NFL. After his sophomore year, Rob, 6.5 sacks, you can see some plays on film that suggest there's some NFL ability there, but he's a little bit of a tweener in terms of his size with his skill set. and his athleticism is not great. So you put all those tools together, it's understandable why he slipped to undrafted. And quite frankly, the sack numbers just have not been there the last couple of years at SMU, but he's played against some really good competition. He obviously comes from a great program. DeSoto's kicked out a lot of really good NFL players year in, year out, one of the best programs in football-crazed Texas. So Levelston's going to be a long shot to make this team. And yet at the same time, it'd be interesting to see what he and Byron Murphy II can do together, because they have that odd chemistry that you don't often see in the NFL as guys that played together at high school level.
Yeah, and I mean, even going back further to DeSoto, Texas, DeSoto High School, that's where Laviska Shenault played as well. So I think that angle is interesting. I think that, young people have an ability to kind of motivate each other. And so I do think that aspect is worth mentioning. I also just think, as you said, we're talking about a player who is a bit of a tweener and didn't have the flashy success as his career went on to earn himself an NFL draft selection. But he's 6'3.5" and 280 pounds. He's got 33-inch arms. And while he isn't explosive, I think he was 5.08 in the 40-yard dash. So a solid time, but not elite for a guy who's 280 pounds. You're looking for something more in that 4.7-ish kind of a range. He does have some power. He does have some burst off the ball. And one of the things very similar to some of the defensive linemen that we've talked about recently, he's got some lateral quickness to him. And the fact that the Seahawks seem to be prioritizing that with all of these defensive linemen that they signed in free agency, what that suggests to me, Corbin, is basically what we probably already knew based on what Mike McDonald did in Baltimore, but that there's going to be an awful lot of twists and stunts and pressures coming from unexpected positions like linebacker, safety, corners coming down, and defensive linemen lined up in one gap, and then right as the snap happens, then shifting significantly to their left or to their right. And that is one of the things that I see with Levelston here. So I am intrigued by it. I do believe that he's probably behind, say, Pickering as one of the undrafted free agents that are trying to carve their way into the Seahawks roster. And again, at roughly 6'4", 280 pounds, I think that he's more of a defensive end, but he doesn't have elite burst up the field, but he is powerful enough and does use his hand and coordinate that with his feet well enough that I think with a little bit of fine tuning, you might be able to get something out of him.
Interestingly, when you look at his pro day numbers, athletic testing wise, and you look at his height, his weight, he almost is identical to Draymond Jones coming out of Ohio State. And I'm not saying that he is a Draymond Jones 2.0. Clearly did not have the production, the hype coming out of one of the top programs in college football, but both ran in that low 5 range in the 40-yard dash, and kind of similar players. Draymond Jones has cut his teeth in the NFL with his hand usage and his ability to get off guys and underrated burst on the field. And I think you can see that at times with Levelston. So no, I'm not going to say he's the next Draymond Jones, but I think that you can say that might be a reasonable comp from a skill set standpoint and how the Seahawks might try to use him as somebody that can play 3-tech and also slide out as a big end if you want to use him that way. So he'll be a guy to keep a close eye on. It's still a cool story with him and Byron Murphy II reuniting and getting the opportunity to play together now in OTAs going into training camp with the Seattle Seahawks. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, again, we've got not one, but 2 episodes. We'll have our regular Wednesday programming, maybe a few more predictions for the schedule, a few more leaks to break down, and then we will have our instant analysis when the schedule actually does come out tomorrow night, and we figure out when and where the Seahawks will be playing all their opponents this upcoming season. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday night, and thanks for listening in. Go Hawks.